Hello everybody, right, I've received a request to talk a little bit about the 1895 and 1897 pattern British infantry officers' swords, which is one of these, okay? First things to say about it, the 1897 pattern infantry officer's sword is the same sword that's still carried today by British infantry officers in the army. However, it has changed a little bit over time in that it's got a little bit lighter and narrower in general, I would say. However, it's fundamentally the same pattern that's been in use since 1897. So to start off, I think we'll look at a comparison with what came before it. So what I have here is the 1854 pattern British infantry officer's sword, and you can see that it's a slightly curved, brass-hilted, cut and thrust sabre. Okay, in comparison to the 1897 pattern I'm holding in my right hand, which is dead straight, it's much narrower in the upper portions of the blade, although it's the same width at the base of the blade. And essentially it's not really designed at all for cutting. It's basically a very, I would say, thrust-centric sword. So you can debatably cut to some extent with it, but you can't really cut in the same way that you can do with the more traditional sabre. So essentially what happened is, to start off with this sword, in 1822 there was a sabre introduced for all infantry officers in the British Army that had a hilt exactly like this, but the blade, which I'll talk about this type of blade in another video, was pipe-backed, it's called, which means it was essentially like a flat curved blade with a rod section, a circular section running up the back of it. And this was a style of blade that was supposedly introduced by a sword cutler called Prosser of London, and that became popular at the very end of the Napoleonic Wars. I won't talk too much about that type of blade, but essentially by 1845 that type of blade wasn't popular anymore, so they brought in this type of blade, which Wilkinson claimed to have pioneered and even designed. In actual fact, I think that was partly a marketing trick on their part, because in actual fact it's no different really to types of blade that had been used much earlier, and in fact that were in use on cavalry swords, on cavalry troopers' swords at the same period as this. So it wasn't really a new type of blade, it was actually, if anything, a return to an older type of blade. But essentially they're usually either 1 inch or 1 1/8 inch wide at the base, and they tend to keep that width pretty much all the way up until the last few inches where they sharpen to a point. They've got a false edge for the last kind of 8 inches roughly. The centre of percussion is usually about there on these swords, and that coincides usually with the last part of the fuller. You can see they have a fuller running up the back of the blade on each side, and they have a flat or slightly rounded back. So it's essentially actually a back sword. It's a very slightly curved back sword blade on the old 1822 style hilt. So essentially it's an 1822 hilt with an 1845 blade. And these usually get called by collectors and online as 1845 pattern swords. In actual fact, there's another detail, which is sometimes the inner section of this guard was folding, and on the earlier ones it was always folding, and so that was known as the 1845, or is now known as the 1845 pattern. When it becomes fixed from the mid-1850s, shall we say, that tends to be called the 1854 pattern. In actual fact, I'm working on some research at the moment which might dispute that a little, because I've got quite a number of these types of sword now, and my observation is that they tend to have the folding guard right up until about 1858, 1859, and after that they're pretty much all fixed, solid brass. The reason for that is obviously because it's a stronger guard. I would say that's almost certainly the reason why they stopped making the hinged section. The hinged section on the inside, incidentally, was just to make the sword more comfortable to wear on the belt when it's against your side. So actually it became a more practical fighting weapon. Now throughout the 19th century there was an ongoing debate about cut versus thrust, which I'll talk about a completely different time. I don't want to get into that now because it's a huge topic. But essentially, for the purposes of this video, all there is to say is that there was a gradual move towards straighter blades in British infantry officers' swords in general, straighter blades, and favouring the thrust as time went on. And by 1892 this has got to a point whereby they actually issued a completely new blade for the British infantry officer, and that was this type of blade. So if we ignore the hilt, because what initially happened in 1892 was this hilt got rebladed with this blade. Okay, so this hilt, this blade, so a straight thrusting blade on the old hilt. It wasn't long, of course, before they realised, well, okay, we've replaced the blade, we may as well improve the rest of the sword as well. So the next thing to come along, in fact, was a new hilt. And the main changes that came in were this steel guard instead of the brass one, and this back strap, as it's called, this steel part of the hilt which runs up the back of the handle. This becomes fully checkered, if you can see. Hopefully you can see that on camera. It's completely checkered down the back, and what that does is it enables you, when you're holding the sabre with the thumb up the back, to have a much more secure grip, and of course that facilitates giving thrusts more securely. You're less likely to lose your grip on the weapon, and inevitably, or rather indisputably, the guard was a much improved design on the brass guard, because the brass, firstly, it could be cut through in an extreme situation by a heavy cutting sword like a tulwar or a dervish's cascara, for example. The brass was also had a tendency to get dented quite easily if you dropped the weapon or it banged against a doorway or something like that. And also it had gaps, as you can see here, has gaps such that if you're using a thrusting weapon and so is the opponent, the point can quite easily come through these openings in the guard here and stab you in the hand. And stabbing you in the hand is clearly not a good thing, because it could disable you and possibly disarm you. So essentially they brought in this steel guard, which has got far smaller holes, and it's of steel, of course. It should also be mentioned, when they first brought this guard in, the holes were somewhat bigger, and they actually, over time, the holes, generally speaking, got smaller, so that it was a more protective guard, in fact. And so what you'll sometimes see listed is an 1895 pattern, as opposed to an 1897 pattern. All that really means is that this folded part on the inside of this, on the guard here, this is an 1897 pattern, and that's designed so when you're wearing it, it's not going to rub your clothes, it's not going to be uncomfortable against you. Initially, in 1895, when this basic guard was designed, it didn't have that turned over lip on the inside edge there. So in actual fact, what you've got is, first of all, an 1892 blade comes in, then an 1895 hilt comes in, and then in 1897 the final change is to fold that lip over, just a small modification to the hilt there. So in actual fact, within a short number of years, these poor British infantry officers had to upgrade their, well, they didn't have to upgrade the weapon, but they were, it was suggested that they upgrade their weapon 3 times within 1 decade, which must have been quite annoying for them. However, having said that, they weren't actually forced to, and we know that as late as the First World War, some officers who'd been serving for a long period of time were still carrying old-fashioned type swords with brass hilts and so on. And in actual fact, this sword itself is a good example, because this is a sword made by Pillin, and because of the serial number on the back, I actually know, and also because of the officer's details on the blade, I know that this blade itself dates to 1893, and this is an 1897 guard. So almost certainly when this blade was first bought from the sword maker, it had this style of hilt on it. And then in 1897, 98, 99, probably something like that, this new hilt was added to it. And what people often ask is, was this really an improvement? Well, the problem with answering that question is always a lack of evidence. What you have to understand is that by the 1890s, as far as the British Army was concerned, swords got used very, very rarely. There are some isolated examples from the Omdurman campaign in 1898 against the dervishes in the Sudan, and there's a few instances where swords were possibly used, although there's not many good descriptions of what actually happened, in the Boxer Rebellion, and also possibly in India as well, in sort of local actions. So, generally speaking, the problem with assessing whether this is a better sword than this is that swords weren't really used very much by the 1890s, because revolvers and semi-automatic pistols had come along, and they were the preferred officer's weapon. Whereas when this sword was around, in the Indian Mutiny and the Crimean War and so on, most officers, in fact, many officers didn't have pistols at all. Some officers had single-shot pistols, and the few lucky or wealthy ones had revolvers. But even those revolvers were quite unreliable. The Colt 1851, for example, was prone to jamming, and of course there's a question of actually being able to hit your opponent with the pistol. Actual marksmanship with pistols was fairly poor, according to lots of accounts. So the sword essentially was still a very important weapon, or quite an important weapon on the battlefield in 1850, but was not a very important weapon anymore by 1890, except debatably as a cavalry weapon, but this of course is an infantry weapon. So to answer the question of whether this last, final and current infantry officer's sword is a better sword than the previous one, you can't definitively answer the question because the evidence is lacking. However, for my part, completely subjectively, I would say as a thrusting weapon it's fantastic. It's much more rigid than the previous model. The previous model is the same weight as this, but is broader, so it's therefore flatter and more flexible, which is good for cutting, but in the thrust this is definitely better. So if you like thrusting, or it suits your style of swordsmanship, this is the better weapon. However, it's in a way less versatile, because you don't really have the option to cut in the traditional sense. You could probably draw cut or push cut, but you're not going to be able to give the same sort of cleaving cuts that you can with the old sabre. In terms of quality, the blade quality pretty much the same makers were making these swords. The guard, I would say, is definitely an improvement, for the reasons I mentioned before. Certainly the guard is steel instead of brass. It's got much smaller openings and it covers more of the hand. And the grip, you could say, is an improvement as well. Lastly, I'll just say completely subjectively, I personally much prefer the earlier Victorian infantry officer's sword, because we have lots of sources remaining, for example listed in D.A. Kinsley's books, and the latest version, Swordsman of the British Empire, that are essentially describing this weapon being used, whereas we don't really have any descriptive accounts of this weapon. And I also personally find this a more pleasing, the old curved sabre, a more pleasing design. Even the hilt, even if the hilt's a little less practical, I prefer the look of it. So I'm biased, and I accept that I'm biased, but there we go. In terms of actual weight and length, they're pretty much the same. So essentially one's better for thrusting, one's cut and thrust compromise. So there we go. I hope that's helpful.